Thank you. Welcome everyone to the 10th annual Lion's Den. This is a giant room, and there's not many people in it. If I can encourage the people from this side to maybe just come a little bit closer, that would be great. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Anish Agarwal from the University of Pennsylvania. Really appreciate folks coming again to this giant room during the lunch hour. So please come over so we can see your faces. And I'm really excited to be here. So I've moderated Lion's Den before. For those of you not familiar with it, we stole the idea more or less from Shark Tank, but it's the Lion's Den. The lions you see before you are Dr. Duran, Dr. Abella, Dr. Moore from their respective institutions. Each is an accomplished, experienced, and fierce researcher. And they are going to be our judges as we have a panel of contestants who range in both interests but also in their training and where they are, who are all going to pitch their research ideas to, again, our fierce lions beside me. Afterwards, each pitch will be about 6 to 7 minutes, and we'll hear the lions' reactions, and if they will invest their time, mentorship, and feedback for these budding research pilots and ideas. So I'm really excited, and a little bit of ground rules. So as I said, our lions, feel free to be kind and gentle or to be like reviewer 2 on every grant that I write. We have 5 contestants who are looking for sponsorship, feedback, and really just guidance. And then we'll hear their pitches. 7 minutes to sell, and then 5 minutes to hear from our lions. And I'll try to keep us pretty close to that timeline. Up first, Dr. Reyes. And I'll ask each contestant just to tell us who they are really quickly and where they're coming from. That'll advance for you. Just do that.
Okie doke. Hello, everyone. So my name is Jose Reyes. I am a current chief resident at Cook County, and I'm also going to be the inaugural research fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. Woo-woo. And so I am going to be talking about my research proposal today, which is going to be focused on encouraging active medical management by EM physicians related to first trimester pregnancy loss. And so we all know that the field of reproductive health has been changing significantly. We have the post-OBS decision, and then beyond that, there's been other challenges that the field has been facing. And so namely, what we've been seeing is that obstetrical wards have been closing across the United States. And so how that ends up affecting us is that we have a lot of patients, and also the community at large is then looking to us to fill that void and for us to provide care. And so there's been some recent studies that have basically been trying to evaluate, what does care for early pregnancy loss or miscarriage in the emergency department look like? And so what we see is whenever patients come to the emergency department, they're about 50% less likely to receive any type of active medical management. Whether we tell them to go to an obstetrical clinic or anything else, they will likely not receive it in the end. In addition to that, what we see is that patients are overall not really liking the experience they have in the emergency department. They feel confused, they feel dissatisfied, and then in the end, they don't get the care that they deserve. And so with that, my proposal would be to aim to try to develop this and promote this by making it so that we could then become more involved in and actively managing a first trimester pregnancy loss, so that patients don't feel confused, they feel like they have a sense of direction, and so that they also get some benefits out of their coming to the emergency department and aren't necessarily, all the weight isn't placed on them to go and find an obstetrician when we know that it's going to be getting only harder and harder. And so this is in line with what our field has been talking about recently. And so last year in 2023 at ACEP, we actually passed a resolution that was aiming to promote this practice and is aiming to develop this. But the issue is that we don't really have the data that supports this. We know that it's safe in the outpatient setting, and we know that if you are a pediatrician, if you're a family medicine physician where they have different patients, they can do this safely. And so we can presume that, but we should be getting some data so that all of us feel comfortable doing this and all of us know that we're not necessarily doing harm if we do start to do it. So then with that in mind, I started to kind of imagine 3 different projects that could potentially do this. And so project A is going to kind of be the most resource intensive, but it would potentially have the greatest effect in terms of promoting this practice. And so this would then be theoretically looking at adverse events, and we could then say that if there's no difference in adverse events, we should be doing it. But you would need to be adequately powered, you would need around 1,000 to 6,000 patients recruited, which I think is just unfeasible, in my current stage. The next project would be establishing whether active medical management is superior to expectant management, which has been our standard. And so that would just need to be about 120 to 160 patients to be adequately powered, so that's a little bit more feasible. The last project, which I think would be the less resource intensive, but doesn't necessarily directly evaluate outcomes of patients, which would be the more patient-centered approach, would be an implementation science-based project, which would then develop an educational intervention, approach EM physicians, teach them on this practice, and then see in a pre-post manner whether they have a significant uptake in terms of this practice, and then you could retrospectively go back and do a retrospective analysis of the patients who receive this practice and make sure that there's no gross discrepancies in terms of the adverse events. But of course, this would be underpowered, and it would also have significant limitations in terms of selection bias, since us, presumably as EM physicians, would only want to do this when we felt like we had a safe patient in which this was safe to do. And so that basically kind of leads me to say, like, Project A, probably not feasible. Project B and Project C would be the ones that I would try to move forward with. And so the reasons we should do this, one, is because there's a want from our colleagues. Two, there's a need from our patients. And three, there's an opportunity with the Biden administration not releasing $200, they actually release a millionfold, so $200 million in terms of research funding related to reproductive health. And so really this is the time for us to take a leadership role and for us to make sure that we can provide direction to the field of obstetrical care so that we're not catching up like we've done all these other years. And so I think that this project and this opportunity is really a time where we can become the shapers of the field. And so my specific ask from the Lions would be just to provide some direction in terms of the logistics. I have not done a study that is this involved or requires this much resources. And so I think Project B and Project C each have their own benefits, their own pros, but I think some of the cons need to be balanced together, right? I think some of the pros of one being that one is going to be more easily conducted from a logistics perspective, but it wouldn't directly evaluate patient outcomes. But then you have B, which does evaluate patient outcomes, but not necessarily the most important thing for EM physicians, which would be adverse events. And so with that, I would just want to know if there is a specific idea from these experienced researchers in terms of what they see would be the most valuable in terms of time and would actually result in the greatest increase in terms of the uptake of this practice. And so with that, here are my references, and I open it up to questions.
I was just going to say first, we're lions, but we don't bite, so feel free to come closer. I guess since I have the mic, I can say, good job, Jose. That was a really great, clear, concise presentation. I don't know much about Shark Tank. I'll give that disclaimer. Sometimes it's on in the break room in the emergency department when I'm working. For whatever reason, it's a favorite of our Bellevue nurse team, so I've seen it a little bit. But I think I'm supposed to say something like really mean, but I'm not going to. I thought you did a great job highlighting kind of the need and also the fact that there's an ASAP resolution, I think is a really big plus and brings it along. I was a little bit unclear, and it might be due to the fact that I'm mainly a researcher and not a clinical person anymore, about what exactly would be involved in the medical management that you were talking about. So, that's something that maybe you could clarify in future presentations. But I think what I'd say is that you presented A, B, and C, and I actually think that they're all too big, maybe both for your stage of your career and also in terms of what it sounds like from what you're saying, like where we're at with the data. So I might encourage you to even think a little smaller, especially are you thinking about like doing a K award application maybe or something to the NIH?
It'll probably be within the next 2 years, yeah.
Yeah. So, doing something smaller where maybe you're thinking about doing some qualitative data collection first with patients. Do they want this in the emergency department and with providers? And thinking about, maybe maybe that's your aim 1 and your aim 2 could do some chart review and your aim 3 could be even a really small pilot to see if it works for feasibility. And that could then lead you into one of your A, B, and C studies. All feel like R01 type studies to me, to be honest with you. So that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Jose, what exactly is the intervention? It's not entirely clear to me for this medical management. Is this sort of a drug therapy intervention? Is this a follow-up intervention? Like, what's the exact thing you're thinking about?
So then the intervention itself would be active medical management, which at this point consists of misoprostol and mifepristone, which has been observed to be like safe in an outpatient setting together and resulted in significant decrease in terms of the length of bleeding of patients and overall has a positive outcome in terms of like this is a very stressful event.
So given that, is there downside to not doing it, or rather, would you have a problem in an RCT that, especially a single-site RCT, where people would just sort of like say, oh, he convinced me this sounds good, I'm going to do it. In other words, things like this have a big risk of sort of bleed over contamination into control arms. You know, if I'm an emergency doc and I see people doing this, I'm like, oh, that sounds like really smart. It's just a matter of like getting over the barrier to doing it. It's endorsed and approved. How can you ensure the control group wouldn't do it?
That is a good question. I mean, I think how I would end up ensuring that the control group doesn't do it is by saying that there's differences in terms of the patient populations that present to the emergency department. So from that study in JAMA, what we did find is that there was like a significant difference in terms of the number of adverse events in terms of like patients needing either like transfusions or other like further interventions from presenting to the emergency department. And I think the question is it because they're just sicker, or is it because they didn't receive some type of active management, right? And so I think it would be reasonable to explain to people that we actually don't know, like, if they are sicker, like, if they're coming because they're sicker and they have those outcomes that are, like, more adverse, that would make it so that it is a little bit, it's not necessarily, like, we don't necessarily know if there's going to be the true unequivocal benefit that we think. And so I think that would encourage people to then stick with either being in the control arm and not having a crossover. I think if you explain that, like, realistically, both sides could be more beneficial because this population could be different than what they see in the outpatient setting.
Could be. I think combining what my illustrious colleague suggested about ambition and sort of big picture stuff and some of this discussion, I would opt towards C, which is a non-RCT. RCTs have a lot of issues that make them just bigger and more ambitious. Maybe just a before and after where you implement a program in a cohort and see how you do, because that might provide data and better understanding for subsequent RCT. So,
perfect, thank you.
I'm gonna jump in here. It sounds like we already have some good back and forth here. Sorry, Nick, I'm sure you'll get a chance for the next contestant here. Thanks, Jose. Next, we'll meet Dr. Hagerman. Just push the screen button.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much. I'm Tom Hagerman. I'm a fourth-year emergency and internal medicine resident at Henry Ford in Detroit. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I'm going to talk, it did advance. I'm going to talk about a project called the Get Home Safe Discharge Intervention and Education Intervention for emergency medicine residents to improve the ED discharge process for older adults. So I want to start with a poll. I'd ask, raise your hand, think back to residency. So if you can remember in residency, did you ever receive discrete education on how you should talk to a patient about their discharge process or discharge instructions? Raise your hand if you got education on this. Okay, we have like 1, 2, 3, 4 hands maybe. And more so, in residency, did an attending physician ever supervise you giving these instructions? We have like a 3. Okay. So this is why we're doing this. A lot of EM education, we went into EM to do awesome procedures, chest tubes, intubations, resuscitations, not really to like talk to people when they leave. So a lot of our focus in residency is on gathering the history, triaging patients, interpreting studies, providing treatments and procedures, and then we kind of say, oh, we did our job, we did an awesome job. You're good, you can go home now. And so, I've gotten to like see patients in the ED, see them in the clinic, and they, says, what'd you do? What happened in the emergency room? I'm like, I don't know. What was your diagnosis? I have no idea. Well, what did they tell you to do for it? I don't know. Or I've gotten to answer their MyChart questions, like, hey, what happened to me there? So this is, why I'm excited about this. And so especially for older adults, they have complex medical problems. There's a lot of things going on. And they may leave the emergency department without really an understanding of what should come next. And so this like ED mentality of let's treat them and treat them doesn't always do a good job. Especially older adults, they may have more barriers, difficulty following up, changes in their mentation or lack of like support at home to achieve that discharge plan. And so, we know that checklists can work well. On the right, it's really small, but this is like an evaluation just for a chest tube. So you can see, we'd love to evaluate, think about the checklist process for exciting procedures, crikes, et cetera. But then we kind of, we haven't really received much on how we can actually have a conversation with a patient when they're ready to go. And so what I've proposed is kind of a multi-component education intervention. Specifically first would be just like a resident talk on the components of this. We'll talk about the mnemonic in a second. I'm really sorry. Second would be like standardized patient practice sessions, right? We do this in medical school to have difficult conversations, but we may need a little bit of practice with live people, some feedback on how we're doing. And then finally, residents would actually get, we would have research assistants supervise discharge conversations and give residents feedback on how they did with their conversations. Multitude, like a wealth of data shows that we don't do a great job with these conversations. We often leave out like key information and often leave out checks for patient understanding. And it's not just, do you have any questions, but actually assessing whether patients understand things. And so the mnemonic we have here is get home safe. It involves, delivering the patient their diagnosis, or at least the lack of a clear diagnosis, telling them important tests that happened, treatments that they should take at home, medications, non-medication treatments, assessing whether they need a caregiver or someone to support them in this conversation, and finally giving them good return precautions and then a check for patient understanding. And so we'll do a pre-post like intervention study. The primary outcome will be the resident inclusion of these seven essential components of the discharge conversation, and that'll be measured by like research assistants at the bedside. Sorry, I'm getting a little seizure here with the slides. And then the secondary outcomes will be patient comprehension of their discharge instructions, also measured by research assistants. And then another secondary outcome, their adherence to the follow-up recommendations, like seeing their PCP or seeing the specialist you recommended. And so we'll compare the pre and the post intervention patients, evaluate if this like multi-component discharge intervention, improved these. And so I would love your thoughtful critiques, how we can make this better, how it can be disseminated, and such. So thank you so much.
Yeah, great.
Thanks.
You convinced me that we probably ought to do that.
What's that?
You convinced me that we probably should train people how to discharge people.
I think so.
Is there a research question here, or is this really just that we ought to train people how to do something? Because I'm always a little bit worried when we sort of anchor on the solution, right? Mm-hmm. If we back up and we say, why is it that people don't actually know what happened in the emergency department? Mm-hmm. Is it actually that they weren't discharged? Right. And if this is the right solution, and this is just a quality improvement project that we ought to just implement, then evaluating the outcomes of that kind of makes some sense. Yeah. But if the question is, if we put a bunch of energy into teaching people how to discharge people better, then will they discharge people better? I think I probably know the answer to that.
Yeah, right.
Especially if everybody said that nobody's ever been trained like how to do this.
Right, and I think like this is only one component of a good discharge, right? I think we have to rely on like a team of people, and this doesn't really account for the work that the nurses do, but it's just kind of like a non-starter. Like previous research has shown in like 20% of cases, a physician's not even going back to the patient to let them know. And so I think like this is, this must take place, but there's obviously other parts of helping patients have a safe discharge that are beyond the physician.
Yeah, I guess the last thing that I would say is that for a project, you want to make sure that it's interesting if you're right, or if you're wrong.
Yeah.
All right, so
Right.
you've sold me that we probably ought to do this better, and this might be the right way to do it, but you want to make sure that if your hypothesis is wrong, that you've learned something also.
Okay.
Very much agree that I think you've sold me that this is an important topic, but I'm not entirely sure I know what problem you're trying to solve. And here's what I mean by that. I mean, it sounds great, and we should just do it. But what's the issue? And I think what I might suggest as a starter project before you do this is maybe you start talking to older adults or looking at your seat, like, what's the lesion? Is the lesion follow-up at 2 weeks? I don't know. Is the lesion they're not filling their meds or prescriptions? Is the lesion that they come back to the ER because they're confused and so it's recidivism? In other words, I think you chose a secondary outcome measure that's clinical, follow-up in 2 weeks, but I don't know if that's the problem.
Yeah, I guess my thought of the lesion is like poor understanding of discharge instructions, because it's been shown like pretty well, and so I don't know.
And I'd agree that understanding may be difficult, but if there's not if it doesn't affect them clinically, if you're
I got it.
Okay, they're confused, but
Right.
like same amount of follow-up, same amount of prescribing, same amount of everything. So no, I don't mean to demean it. I think you're onto something important. I think there is a lesion. I just don't know what it is yet, and that's I think where the science is. So I think if you frame it around what's my question, I think a question of what are the problems, like what are the problems with elderly discharge, and where is it going wrong, and then that can inform your subsequent outcome measure.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Just, first, before I piggyback off of that, nice acronym. I'm a big fan of a good
Yeah,
acronym.
that
and
took a
that's always like
second.
the first hurdle, right? And aging research, you've got a good potential funder if you're eventually doing Ks and stuff with National Institute on Aging, so you're good there. Along the lines of what's the lesion, I was thinking more towards, what's the lesion in terms of why good discharge isn't happening, and that takes us back to ED processes and is. We always, there's a tendency to go first towards like med ed type interventions, and it's not yet clearly outlined whether that's actually the deficit here. Is it that residents don't understand how to do this, or are there more structural and systemic things happening in the emergency department, that we all know about because we work in EDs, that need to be addressed? And so, I might also take it a step back, and you might find useful, if you haven't seen already, some of the implementation science frameworks, things like, consolidated framework for implementation research, and those frameworks can be helpful in just thinking about identifying what kind of the lesion is and what's the issue that you're looking to solve with your intervention.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you all so much. I wish I had a pen and paper, but appreciate you.
We'll get it back.
Yeah. All right. Thanks again. Yeah.
All right, it seems like our lions are warming up here. It's getting a little bit fiercer each time. I like it. I think I saw beads of sweat on Jose earlier. Next, I'd like to invite, is it Dr. Hecker? All right, welcome.
All right, thank you guys. Nice to meet everybody. I'm Martin Hecker. I'm at U of L in Louisville, and I'm going to talk to you about what we call mobile phone auscultation. Slide advancer.
Green.
Okay. So this is a little AI Firefly image here of what I envision for the future. So if you forget everything else, just know that, does anybody have a phone on them today? So if you're holding a phone, you might be holding a stethoscope. According to the FDA, you are. So the FDA considers mobile phone stethoscopes, and there are about 7 billion in the world, and roughly the same number of people who have access to phones. So a lot of them out there. And they are actually better than the digital stethoscopes that have a whole lot of money funneled into them, and we're holding them right in our pocket. So I want to tell you how we could maybe use them. We're doing a few things already. So we have been working on this for a few years now, really since COVID hit, but we have a paper about to come out finally that looks at ejection fraction. We kind of matched ejection fraction to phone auscultation, so we could have an ER patient come in. I wonder what his EF is. Put the phone on there and you got it. Right now we have 2 studies going on, one for COPD diagnosis, pretty small, 50 patients in each arm to look at diagnosing COPD, and then one on medical countermeasures for infectious disease. But what I want to talk to you about today is for trauma. So the funny thing, and what one bit of advice I'd love from you guys is, we kind of fell into this with physics, like nonlinear dynamics genius who does a lot of the analysis, and we've been branched out into all these other worlds and not EM. And I'm like, how did I end up here? I'm an ER doc. Let's figure out how to study ER patients. So we'll talk about that. And I presented a volume overload model yesterday that fits into this trauma paradigm. So the problem space is the age-old question of how do we identify a sick trauma patient? How do we triage them to the right ER? How do we decide maybe give them some blood products prior to arrival, maybe in the helicopter, so that, cryptic shock, I don't know if that term's still cool, but I still use it with residents. So, some non-invasive means, just like we were trying to do with ejection fraction, volume overload, so some way to tell volume status. And a good friend of mine's a trauma surgeon, and I'll show you in this protocol, like we would love to continue the study up into the hospital because he deals with volume overload in trauma patients. They've dumped 40 units in, and that now the patient's overloaded and they're dialyzing them. So I think this will fit there too. So my approach here, and again, some of these studies, they're just not the same EM mindset, but I'm trying to design how we would do this, maybe even free, since we don't have any active funding, for trauma activation patients. So basically when they hit the ER in a recess room, we would record them with the phone and try to do that on the hour every hour when feasible, not in the OR, but in floor beds and ICUs. We'd collect various measures, vital signs, invasive, non-invasive, and then our outcomes would be like who dies, look at ISS, maybe match that, blood products, how long they're in the hospital, vent days, that sort of thing, who needs surgeries. So why would we be good for this? Well, we've obviously been doing this work for a few years, but again, just kind of like the guy I'm working with, we call him the Wizard of Oz. He's like a genius. He is a businessman background and a physicist, and so like our conversations are, there's a lot of translation between the two of us. And so, we've been doing this work, but I want to get into our wheelhouse of emergency medicine. We're a level 1 trauma center. About in the couple hour radius, we'll take all penetrating and blunt trauma. So this finally, I'm like, we will get you the patients, unlike maybe with the COPD and some of our other stuff. We have a full-time research coordinator who's here right now, Alyssa. And then we have a PhD faculty member we just turned over, but we will pretty soon hire another PhD so they can help write grants. Currently, our sponsor is the one who has written some grants, and our funding is through SBIR, so outside of, again, our normal realm. So what I would love to hear from you guys is, number one, if anybody wants to work with us, we'd love to directly collaborate. I have no conflict of interest. I don't have any equity in this company. I'm just doing all this as an academic, and we'd love to share the academic wealth, as it were. And then how to design this protocol. Maybe if we need funding, we're ready for the August deadline for SAEMF. We haven't applied for one of those grants before, but we're definitely going to apply for that deadline. And then thinking about a multi-site, there's a lecture later today on how to kind of piggyback onto an ongoing clinical trial. We'd love to just, hey, you're doing a trial with a few thousand patients. Can you record them for 20 seconds? That's all we want. And then maybe hit your database later. So those are kind of what I'd love to hear from you guys. And then ultimately, one other topic here is the whole paradigm of doing the research in the ER and then extending it out to pre-hospital, because we actually applied for just an IRB to put a student on ambulances and record them, or to have EMS workers record, and the IRB for the first time ever disapproved of our application, thinking that we might get in the way of patient care. But I think with a funded study, we put an enroller on an ambulance. They're sitting there getting 20-second recordings a couple times en route to the hospital. So I think that paradigm, maybe we study this in the ER first and then extend it out into rural areas, maybe even on the scene, maybe the first person that catches up to an unconscious patient after a car wreck. I'd love to be able to get that golden tricorder diagnosis right away. So I think that's everything I wanted to say. Thanks for listening.
A question. So I'm very intrigued, and you've sold me on this concept that a phone could be a stethoscope. What I don't understand, and maybe I missed it, what exactly are you measuring?
So it's auscultation data. So it's recording the heart, but it's a lot of infrasonic. And like for the volume overload model that I presented yesterday, 10 hertz and below is the main signal he's seeing to be able to delineate people with volume overload and without volume overload. So it's like all the ranges of sound, but
so in theory, it's not really a stethoscope, which can't tell volume overload at all, but rather somehow a non-invasive volume status measurement tool.
and we're going all these different directions. So trying to harness our into one, like with the trauma one. But yeah, like right now we think we can diagnose COPD, maybe diagnose viral infections, but for the volume overload model, it is approximating right atrial pressure and wedge pressure is what I presented yesterday.
Okay, so you have data showing that it correlates with a gold standard
Yes.
measurement of these things. Maybe that was the missing piece.
Sorry, yeah.
So I was-
Well, and that's for volume overload, I don't know how much that would apply to this trauma study, but yes, that for volume overload, it's matching the gold
Okay.
standards there.
So I would suggest, and this may be a theme in all these presentations, of taking a step back. It's a very interesting concept, but it seems to me you probably need just a simple case series of trauma patients where you do these measurements and do some correlation looks. Because I think reviewers, because that's my first instinct, and I think reviewers might have the same, of just skepticism of, how is this going to work exactly? And is this going to help people? So first you need to show, okay, we just measured it in 20 or 30 severe trauma patients, and here's what we have. And isn't this interesting? It seems to correlate with their need for blood products or their whatever.
Right.
And then that'll help convince people that you've got something. Does that sort of make sense? That might be
Totally.
the first study to do.
Yeah, that we're planning that. Like we already have the IRB ready to apply and like gather just a short series, right? Step one. Thank you.
Member and just ask a clarifying question,
Yeah.
which I don't think I got at all till the last picture. Is this just holding the phone in a location? Does the phone need software? Does it need additional hardware? Or is it just a phone? And then have you addressed sterility issues with a phone which is dirtier than a toilet seat in many studies? For real.
No, great question. It's in the slides yesterday I showed it's unenhanced, very cheap mobile phones, Android or Apple. The microphone on the phone is just insanely capable. And so, yeah, unenhanced. And we just use the IRB approved us to just wipe off with an alcohol pad. So only the microphone's where the speakers are. And we do place it directly on the skin. And pacemaker patients are excluded because of the magnets. But yeah, so basically you're just, a lot of our studies, just one spot, 20 seconds, sometimes 10-second recording, take it off, you're finished.
I'm now terrified that my phone is listening to everything, even more than I used to be.
Right, yeah.
We have time for one. Yeah, I think that, again, this is interesting, but I guess I sort of share your skepticism because I don't understand the physiology, right? So volume overload's different from volume depletion, and I don't know, without kind of a conceptual model, if this is something that actually is going to measure volume depletion, which I imagine in trauma patients is really what you're after here. So I don't actually know that doing this in acute trauma patients in the trauma bay is the right place to do it, right? Sometimes you'd go and try to validate that technology in people who are volume depleted, maybe in the intensive care unit where you don't have some of the same issues around consent and other things, because just making the leap that volume depletion and volume overload are going to just be, that you're looking at the same disease in a spectrum of disease, I don't know is going to be true here. I'd love to see more of a model of why you think that physiology works.
Sure, cool.
Another good place would be operative setting. Partner with a surgeon who's doing major aortic or other bleedy things, and consent people, nice controlled environment, consent them, say, hey, we're going to take some non-invasive measurements, and then we're going to measure blood loss and blood transfusion, and that gives you a great preliminary data set.
Sure, cool.
And part of this is having a good gold standard that you can trust, right? And having something that you can measure and believe.
Right. Awesome, thank you. Cool, thank you.
I like seeing the line come out of the audience. Thanks, Dr. Allender. Next, I'll invite Dr. Hazenkamp. Oh, yeah, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. For our second to last.
Another great
contestant.
acronym.
Hey everyone, my name is Corey Hazenkamp. I'm a third-year emergency medicine resident at one of the New York City Health and Hospitals, Lincoln Medical Center, which is in the South Bronx. And I'm going to pitch my idea for puppies, which is a new clinical assessment tool to measure opioid withdrawal, specifically in the emergency room. So a big problem, as everyone should be at least semi-aware of, is that we've, as a country, experienced a huge increase in overdose deaths attributed to opioids. This graph is provided by the National Center for Health Statistics, and the black line is opioids overall, which includes like heroin, synthetic, semi-synthetic, or natural opioids. and the brown line is synthetic opioids. So a huge contributor to this issue, as we all know, is fentanyl. The problem got really bad during COVID, and it's just continued to get worse since then. The good news is we do have a solution. This has been around for like 20 years now. I think we're all familiar with medications for opioid use disorder, specifically buprenorphine. It decreases mortality and morbidity related to opioid use disorder. It's been shown specifically in RCTs to increase retention as patients follow up either in addiction medicine clinics or rehab programs. And importantly, to our boarding problems, it decreases ED visits, bounce backs, hospitalizations. And so there's this gap, like why, if we have had this solution for 20 years, why are we still like dealing with this problem? There's two gaps that I believe are part of the discordance here. One, there's no real consensus on what COWS score should be used to initiate ED or buprenorphine in the emergency department. On the left is on the SAMHSA website. They recommend a COWS of 12, and they actually even say maybe even more for patients who use fentanyl, which is essentially everyone now. So like unclear guidance from SAMHSA, which is a government agency. And on the right is a protocol endorsed by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which recommends a COWS of 8 or more, which I think is more common. But still no like consensus. Like there's no overall, like, this is the number you can give buprenorphine. And a second part of that is, as clinicians, I think we're all afraid of precipitating withdrawal in our patients with opioid dependency. If you give buprenorphine to a patient who's not in enough, or in like a serious enough withdrawal, or yeah, you'll precipitate withdrawal. And so that's actually been studied and shown to be a barrier to ED-initiated buprenorphine specifically. So my pitch and my solution to this is the puppies. It's a dichotomous mnemonic. It stands for, and it's a yes or no, essentially, questionnaire. So you go with like pulse, is there, or pupils. I always get the P's mixed up, I'm sorry. So do they have pupillary dilation, yes or no? U stands for uncontrolled. Are they actively vomiting and having diarrhea in your emergency department, yes or no? Pulse, is their heart rate 100 or greater? Can you see piloerection? Are they yawning, or are they having, and we use secretions for the S just to make the mnemonic, so are they like having rhinorrhea actively in front of you? These are all objective components of the COWS score, so that they've already been validated. This isn't something I just created out of thin air. If you pull up the COWS score, it's in the MD Calc and whatever you use to remember that. So why should the Lions invest in me? I think the COWS score sucks. I think it's incredibly subjective. Two people can calculate a COWS score and get wildly different scores. It's 11 items. I'm pretty confident no one in this room has the COWS score memorized, and its scale is larger than the NIH score. It goes from 0 to 48. The NIH score goes to 42, so it's like, I don't know why we need a scale from 0 to 48 to measure opioid withdrawal. Opioid use disorder is going to be a part of emergency medicine whether we like it or not, so we might as well be part of the solution. And unless you're like a really hardcore cat person, most people think puppies are really cute, and I think this can contribute to breaking the stigma when we treat patients with opioid use disorder. So my ask, I'm actually applying to research fellowships now, and this has been a really cool project in residency because it's pretty easy, not a heavy lift, but is this something I should actually invest my time into, like moving forward, thinking past, I'm about to start my PGY 4-year, but like moving past residency, like, is this worth my time? Can cows be taken down? And I'm currently measuring that, like my first step was to measure the inservator reliability, just to see if it's better than cows, because I think it is. And so I would just like some guidance on like what would be the next steps to actually get buy-in on this, because COWS is like deeply integrated into all of our education and EPIC and our EHR, so it wouldn't be like an easy task. And that's it.
Hey, Corey, nice to see you in person.
Yeah, how's it going?
You're in my wheelhouse now, so I apologize. But okay, is it worth investing your time? No, don't do this. I think you could do something else. You've identified a really important problem. that's like the great starting point. So that's fantastic. You know, OUD and this huge gap, right? Why aren't we doing BUP in the ED? It's a huge gap. There has been some research on it. And I think that like starting with, and you've probably done some of this, but starting with like a really thorough literature review to look at some of the work done from, you know, like Ryan McCormick, Kate Hawk, Gail D'Onofrio. They've done a lot of qualitative and implementation research to identify some of the gaps. And in general, you know, that research is your preliminary research, and it has not shown that the gap here is that the CALS is not a good measure. There is some fear about precipitated withdrawal, but even that's kind of changing rapidly in the field. But you know what you haven't told us, if you wanted to do this, I think a first step would be to figure out if CALS is really a barrier. As you said, it's widely implemented. Everybody uses it. You can pull it up on MDCalc. It's not actually that onerous. You'd have to present a more compelling case, I think, that's research-based rather than just saying like CALS sucks and here's puppies. Although I like the acronym puppies, I don't think it'll be the solution to stigma against people with OUD, but it's a nicer acronym than CALS, but I'm just not sure if this is, you haven't presented yet enough kind of compelling evidence to show that this is where you should spend your time.
One way to sort of get at this, and I agree, I think the problem's very important, and I also agree that I'm not sure I buy that CALS is like the fundamental problem, even if it's not great. So I guess the question I would ask, let's say yours is better. Let's envision success. What would you be hoping to make better? What are you reducing? What clinical harm is better by a better CALS score?
Yeah, so I guess the goal would be to like try to get a consensus on a puppy score where ED clinicians can like say yes or no, puppies of 2 start buprenorphine, no questions asked.
Okay, so the goal would be sort of different times and places and prevalence of buprenorphine use based on a better score, is that?
Yeah, just like something like that we could do with, you know, like we don't have a lot of time, so you can just look at a patient and almost calculate a puppy score, and then if there was like a general consensus, you can think like, oh, like this is endorsed by everything, or like the SAMHSA or NIDA, like if the puppy score is 2, like I can give this patient buprenorphine, like I don't have to worry about buprenorphine.
So to peel the onion back a little bit, is your real question, how do we get people to be better compliant with aggressive use of buprenorphine? Is that?
Essentially, yeah.
Right. So that's the scientific center. So then the question is the attack to that problem a better score, or is it better ED education, or is it, in other words, I think you're jumping to a solution a little bit before we understand the mechanism of the problem, you know?
Yeah.
And this is not my space, so I don't know opioid stuff, but is this a problem of healthcare providers not being well educated in identifying things? Is it, I feel like CALS is done so easily. It may not be great, but my heart of hearts tells me it may not be the core of the problem, and a better score may not change this as much as maybe other things.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Important problem.
No, I mean it's been a really fun project. So I don't want to like waste time on this. Is basically where I'm at.
Yeah, I agree with what everybody has said. You're going to change the world, but you've got to decide how to do it.
Yeah.
And so I think part of the bigger issue here that you're hearing is what's the next project and the project after that, and how do you use the results to enable those? Because at the end of this, maybe someday you're going to want to do a trial, or maybe you're going to want some other intervention. And what you're looking for is the piece that allows you to do that so that you can show that there's an intervention that changes the world.
Okay.
And while I don't, at least from my perspective, I don't know that this gets you there.
Right.
But if you figure out what that piece is that's missing so that you can do something as your next project or the project after that, that can be really a helpful way to think about your longer term planning.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
I like the straight up no, Kelly. Like you started so kind. But it's just,
The question was really clear.
we have one more contestant, Dr. Broder. Where are you? There you are. Awesome. Welcome. Thanks for everyone for.
While he's coming up, I just want to remind all of our people, we're you know, this may sound a little unvarnished, but we appreciate what you're doing, and these are great. We're just trying to be helpful. But what I always tell my mentees, you want us to be harsh, because Lord knows the study section will be harsher. So friendly harsh gets you out of trouble when you submit and get slaughtered by grant reviewers. So just keep that in mind. So this is tough love.
I really appreciate the opportunity. And after these great presentations that are very mature and detailed presentations, mine may seem like an amateurish piece. I'm Josh Broder from the Department of Emergency Medicine at Duke, and I just arrived on a plane that was 2 hours late, so thanks for waiting for me. And I noticed it's pretty hot in Phoenix this week, right? Pretty hot, and this is like starting a stand-up routine with an audience that's like giving you this dead eyes look. Right? Pretty hot in Phoenix this week, but you're all nice and comfy, right? And the reason you're nice and comfy is that guy waiting way in the back. Take a look, way in the back. You don't believe me? He's shoveling ice, right? How do we control the temperature in this hotel? Well, I mean, there's a guy in the basement with a big bucket of ice and a thermometer, right? And if it's too hot, he gets more ice, and if it's too cold, he throws the ice out the door. Why are you looking at me like I'm crazy? Isn't that the way that heating and cooling systems work? Well, of course not. Since the early 1800s, we've had this thing called a thermostat that automatically does heating and cooling, controls it. It's part of, we call these today control systems. They exist everywhere. They exist in your car. Unless you have a really old car, you probably have at least some primitive form of cruise control that sets the speed of the car, right? Maybe you got a fancier car today that can like really drive itself. Okay, I came in a plane that was 2 hours late, but it has autopilot, the same concept. And these are already incorporated into medical devices. Things like pacemakers, insulin pumps. And yet, we don't have it in the emergency department, or ICUs or ORs. So here's a cardiac monitor. We have a patient who's either grossly hyper or hypotensive. And we know that blood pressure volatility and extremes of blood pressure can contribute to morbidity and mortality. And yet we rely on a human being looking at the blood pressure reading and then turning to an infusion pump and manually adjusting the vasopressor, vasodilator, fluid infusion, blood transfusion. So we're 150 years in the past in terms of application of technology. Why is that? These are two computers. They speak the same binary language. So I'm here to talk about autonomous blood pressure regulation, and I work with some collaborators in the Duke Pratt School of Engineering. And we've presented on this before, but just think about the places where this might be useful. Of course, for us, we think about the emergency department, but definitely ORs and ICUs on a daily basis. So I know the previous presenters, had the panel talked about picking an environment like an ICU where you see this. And this would be a great venue, OR cases where volatility is important to control. And then we start to think about more austere settings, a military transport where you've got a limited number of providers, and not having to manually control blood pressure would allow a limited provider set to focus on other aspects of care. And perhaps even the most austere of all environments could benefit from this. Now, I also think that this is a crucial research tool, and I'm just giving a few examples. There are probably cases where we haven't identified an important treatment effect for hemorrhagic or ischemic stroke, for aortic dissection, for septic shock, because we're not able to clearly differentiate between a control arm and an experimental or intervention arm. There's too much overlap in the actual blood pressure, so we can't figure out, is target blood pressure X better than Y because there's cross-contamination despite our best efforts. Humans are not good at doing this. This is a little bit like asking your teenager. I've got a 15-year-old. I'm terrified the first time that I get in the car with him to drive because he's sure to oversteer in both directions, right? And that's what we do when we're trying to manually control blood pressure. Here's our data presented last year at SAEM. This is a computer simulation where first we simulated 10,000 cases of hypertension with a gradual increasing trend and superimposed events. And then we just implemented a simple control system. I say simple for Leonardo, because this is calculus. This is a proportional integral derivative model that's used to take what the behavior in the past has been and map it to the current slope and project out so you don't overshoot your target. You slow down your infusion as you approach the target. So we have great data from simulation, and we have a single animal model. We actually did this right before COVID and then had to cancel the rest of the experiment, where we had a pig dying of hemorrhagic shock. And so you see it very hypotensive, and then we turn on the control system, and it immediately begins a recovery toward a target until we ended the experiment. So I think we have the background for this. What is the next step? Our hoped for next step is to take real clinical monitors, and part of the purpose of this is to prep us for a human trial. So we're hacking the clinical monitors. I say hacking, we've got the protocols from the manufacturers, and we're going to build a system that can interface with that monitor and a commercial infusion pump with a dual drug system so that it could handle hypertension or hypotension, and test this in an animal model. And there's several variations on the theme that you could think about, like the example I gave with the simulation where you just see what happened to blood pressure naturally versus when the control system is implemented. And then humans versus machines. This is John Henry versus the steam shovel. We want to see whether the computer or a human being hits the target better. And there, of course, there are many other measures that you could look at, like how much human time is required to attend to blood pressure, because even if the machine performed no better in actually hitting the target, if you could eliminate a human operator, that could be of benefit. And then downstream, of course, looking at clinical outcomes from this. So our team is getting ready for the project. I think my ask of the Lions is really advice and perhaps looking at some of our grant proposals. We're thinking about, of course, SAEM and EMF grants, some NIH grants, Coulter, Stanford Foundation, which are biomedical engineering grants, so, and some manufacturer-sponsored work potentially as well. So thanks for your attention.
Very intriguing idea, very ambitious concept, which is exciting but ambitious. One question, presumably you've done this, but I should ask, have you collected data from the ICUs to make a compelling case that this is a problem? And here's what I mean by that. There's an enormous volume of recorded blood pressure data from God knows how many patients in EPIC and all these things. Can you make the compelling case of, oh, look, here's 10 ICU patients, 100, 1,000 ICU patients. Here are all these outliers above and below a certain threshold that matters. Because my fear is, without making that case, someone could say, okay, this room goes between, to use your analogy, 69 and 72, but it's never going to 50 or 100. Right. So, like, we can accept a couple of degrees and no one even notices that it doesn't hurt us. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So do you have those data to make that case? Because I think that'll be really important, especially if you're going to pitch this to funders, investors, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I think indirectly, and I haven't, not that this is my data I've collected, but if you look at other studies of, I'm just giving you an example, like hemorrhagic stroke, where you're trying to look at controlling blood pressure with a particular 2 targets, and the outcome measures are neurologic outcome, mortality, and then hematoma size, right? And then if you look at the raw data from that, you'll find that there is significant overlap between those 2 groups. So you have patients who are, they're not hitting their target. They're at least a substantial portion of the time falling out of the target range, falling into the other arm's target range. And then, so I'm not perfectly answering your question, but I think you could take studies of that type and use that data to help illuminate the question that you've asked.
Yeah, you're right, it's a partial answer, and that gets at this as a research tool to say you could maybe preset things to have better separation. But I think the bigger question that you're really getting at is, are we solving a clinical problem? Yeah. And you may be, I just don't know. But the good news is this should be very easily doable. It's just a data problem. I mean, it's just retrospective chart review. Because if someone said, look, if you look back at the last 1,000 patients and found that the map never varied by more than plus or minus 10 clicks, and I don't know if that really matters, yeah. As opposed to, wow, 20% of the time at 2 in the morning, the nurse left, don't mean to blame the nurse, the healthcare team left this patient hypotensive for 2 hours before they adjusted the pressors, and that's not good. That would be an important question to ask, because that's going to be the first thing an investor's going to ask, like, what's the scope of this problem?
Yeah. Thank you.
I like the way that you're thinking about that, Ben, but I also think that the other piece of this is a workload piece, right? So even if you could just replicate what people are doing, every ICU in the country has ICU nurses that are so stretched, who have so many things that they're trying to accomplish. Even if you could do just as well as people, I think that there might still be a case for this. But I think that the related question then is that you probably will need to understand a little bit better what the workload piece of maintaining tight blood pressure control is, even if you're not able to do it better with your algorithm, which, based on your data, you very well may be able to.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you to the Lions and the contestants. Really appreciate everyone's engagement, and have a great rest of the conference.